Late May 1942. The room was cold despite the Pacific heat outside. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of desks buried in paper. Radio intercepts lay stacked in uneven piles. Coffee cups gathered beside ashtrays filled to the edge. Ceiling fans pushed warm air in slow circles. In the basement of Pearl Harbor's naval headquarters, men and women studied fragments of Japanese naval code known as JN-25. Lines of 5-digit groups. Repeated patterns. Gaps where meaning should have been. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already moving. For aircraft carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were assembling under strict radio silence. Their destination was hidden behind coded references to a place called AF. Inside this room, the war did not roar. It whispered. One message stood out: AF is short on water. It was a small detail. Routine. Easily ignored. But if AF meant Midway, then the Japanese were coming. And if they were coming, the United States Navy had only days to decide whether to gamble everything on a secret few believed could be trusted. December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor had lasted less than 2 hours. Yet its effects reshaped the Pacific overnight. Battleships lay burning in the harbor. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. The United States Pacific Fleet had been struck hard, but not fatally. The aircraft carriers were not in port. That absence would matter more than anyone understood at the time. In the months that followed, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved with calculated speed. Guam fell. Wake Island was overwhelmed. The Philippines were cut off, then crushed. British forces surrendered at Singapore in February 1942. The Dutch East Indies collapsed soon after. Oil fields, rubber plantations, and naval bases were absorbed into Tokyo's expanding defensive perimeter. Japan's strategy was methodical. Seize territory rich in resources. Establish a fortified ring stretching from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific and down to the Solomon Islands. Force the United States into a negotiated peace before American industrial strength could fully mobilize. At sea, Japan's carrier force, the Kido Butai, remained the most powerful naval striking arm in the world. 6 fleet carriers had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were veterans. Their coordination was unmatched. Carrier aviation, not battleships, now dictated control of the ocean. The United States Navy understood this shift. Under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in December 1941, the American strategy became one of calculated resistance. The fleet was smaller. Resources were stretched. Reinforcements from the Atlantic would take time. Every decision required caution. In April 1942, an audacious raid provided a brief psychological victory. 16 Army B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet, struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid caused limited physical damage. But it shook Japanese confidence. It proved the home islands were not beyond reach. For Japanese planners, that humiliation demanded a response. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, believed the United States must be drawn into a decisive carrier battle, one that would eliminate remaining American carriers before new ones could arrive from American shipyards. His plan took shape as Operation MI. The target, Midway Atoll. Midway was a small coral outpost nearly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It possessed little land. But its location made it critical. Whoever controlled Midway could project air power deeper into the Central Pacific, and threaten Hawaii itself. Yamamoto's design was complex. A carrier strike force would attack and neutralize Midway. An invasion force would follow. Simultaneously, a diversionary attack would strike the Aleutian Islands to split American attention. If U.S. carriers attempted to intervene, they would be destroyed in open battle. The Japanese believed the Americans were reactive. Predictable. Still recovering. But in Pearl Harbor's basement, American cryptanalysts were piecing together fragments of this unfolding design. The Pacific War, still less than 6 months old, had already demonstrated a new truth: ships could cross thousands of miles unseen. Carriers could strike without warning. Battles could be decided before fleets ever sighted one another. By May 1942, the United States had only 3 operational fleet carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The margin for error was thin. One defeat could leave Hawaii exposed. Japan, by contrast, prepared to deploy 4 of its most experienced carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and nearly 250 aircraft. The scale was not equal. And yet, in quiet rooms filled with intercepted radio signals, a different balance of power was beginning to emerge. By the spring of 1942, the war in the Pacific was being fought on 2 fronts. One was visible: ships maneuvering across thousands of miles of open ocean. Aircraft rising from carrier decks at dawn. Convoys threading through contested waters. The other was invisible. It existed in strings of numbers transmitted through the air. In 5-digit code groups embedded in the Japanese naval cipher system known as JN-25. JN-25 was not a simple substitution code. It was a layered system. First, operational words were converted into numerical code groups. Then those groups were further encrypted using additive tables. Random numbers applied to disguise the original meaning. To read a single message required identifying both the base code and the additive layer. Each new edition of JN-25 reset the puzzle. The United States Navy's signals intelligence effort was centered in several locations. In Washington, OP-20G worked to break high-level naval codes. In the Pacific, the most critical node was Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor. It was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was unconventional. He worked long hours, often in a smoking jacket and slippers. He preferred night shifts. He trusted instinct but demanded verification. Around him gathered a small team of linguists, mathematicians, and analysts who had spent years studying Japanese naval communications. They did not have the full codebook for JN-25. They never did. Instead, they reconstructed it piece by piece. Pattern recognition. Traffic analysis. Repetition. Context. They built fragments into working interpretations. By early 1942, they could read portions of Japanese operational traffic, not perfectly, but enough to extract meaning. In April and May, intercepts indicated preparations for a major operation designated MI. References to carrier divisions. Fuel allocations. Assembly points. The tempo of Japanese radio traffic increased, then shifted to enforced silence, itself a clue. One coded location appeared repeatedly: AF. Washington analysts believed AF might refer to locations in the South Pacific. Rochefort and his team disagreed. They believed AF was Midway. The debate was not academic. If AF was Midway, then Japan intended to strike deep into the Central Pacific, and soon. Rochefort needed proof. The solution was simple in concept and risky in execution. Midway would transmit an unencrypted message stating its water distillation plant had failed and that the atoll was short on fresh water. If Japanese intercepts soon referenced water shortages at AF, the identification would be confirmed. On May 20, 1942, Midway sent the message. Days later, Japanese communications reported that AF is short on water. The ambiguity dissolved. Admiral Chester Nimitz now faced a decision. His carriers were outnumbered. Intelligence was strong but incomplete. Japanese forces were divided into multiple task groups, including a northern diversion toward the Aleutians and the main strike force aimed at Midway. Yamamoto believed surprise remained intact. But Nimitz possessed something Japan did not anticipate: foreknowledge. He positioned Enterprise and Hornet northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese scouting range. Yorktown, damaged in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, was rushed through emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours. A feat of industrial urgency, and sent to join them. The American carriers would not defend Midway from the atoll itself. They would wait in ambush. It was a calculated risk built on partial code breaking, traffic analysis, and the judgment of a handful of analysts working in a basement. If the intelligence was wrong, the Pacific Fleet could lose its last carriers. If it was right, Japan's striking arm would sail directly into a trap. By early June 1942, two fleets were moving toward the same patch of ocean. One believed it held the initiative. The other believed it understood the plan. And the difference between those beliefs would soon be measured in minutes. Long before aircraft engines roared over Midway, the battle unfolded in silence. At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, roughly 36 officers and enlisted personnel worked in rotating shifts, often through the night. Many were young. Some had studied Japanese at American universities before the war. Others were mathematicians drawn into cryptanalysis by necessity rather than design. Commander Joseph Rochefort led them with intensity and informality. He resisted bureaucratic interference from Washington. He trusted his analysts' instincts. But every conclusion required evidence. In cryptanalysis, confidence without proof could sink fleets. They worked without glamour. No medals awaited codebreakers if they were correct. If they were wrong, the consequences would not be abstract. 3 American carriers, nearly all that remained in the Pacific, would be exposed. They reconstructed JN-25 through partial decrypts. They compared traffic volumes. They tracked call signs shifting between task forces. Even radio silence told a story. When the Japanese carrier division stopped transmitting, it signaled movement, and movement meant action. These analysts were not on carrier decks. They would not see flames or hear explosions. Yet their interpretation of scattered numbers would determine where those carriers sailed. When AF is short on water appeared in intercepted traffic, it confirmed weeks of deduction. It validated sleepless nights and contested assumptions. But validation did not end the pressure. It sharpened it. Because once you know the enemy's plan, you inherit responsibility for the outcome. And that responsibility moved upward, to the admiral who would decide whether to trust them. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz assumed command of the Pacific Fleet at one of its lowest moments. Pearl Harbor was still scarred. Battleships remained under repair. The fleet's striking power rested almost entirely on 3 aircraft carriers. Nimitz was not impulsive. His leadership style was measured, methodical. He valued intelligence. He understood logistics. He believed in preserving strength for decisive moments. The intelligence from Station HYPO presented both opportunity and risk. The decrypts indicated an attack on Midway around early June. But Japanese operational security remained strong. The exact composition of forces was not fully confirmed. Yamamoto's fleet was widely dispersed: carriers, battleships, cruisers, submarines, spread across vast distances. If Nimitz concentrated his carriers northeast of Midway and the Japanese struck elsewhere, Hawaii could be threatened. If he divided his forces, each could be overwhelmed in detail. He chose concentration. Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, were positioned in advance. Yorktown, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, was rushed back into action despite recent battle damage. Navy Yard workers in Pearl Harbor completed temporary repairs in record time. What would normally require months was compressed into days. Nimitz did not publicize the intelligence. Only a small circle understood its source. Operational security demanded silence. He trusted the codebreakers. He trusted that Yamamoto would follow doctrine, strike Midway first, then draw out American carriers. The gamble was simple in structure and immense in consequence: allow Midway to be attacked. Hold carriers back. Strike when the enemy's decks were vulnerable. It was a decision made in quiet offices, far from the coming fire. Yet it would determine the rhythm of the entire battle. World War II introduced a new dimension to naval warfare: information speed. In previous conflicts, fleets searched for one another across horizons with limited reconnaissance. At Midway, information moved faster than ships. Japanese doctrine emphasized radio discipline. Carrier strike groups often enforced strict silence to prevent interception. But large operations required coordination. Refueling schedules, assembly instructions, reconnaissance patterns, these generated traffic. And traffic, even when encrypted, revealed structure. American listening stations across the Pacific, in Hawaii, Australia, and the West Coast, intercepted thousands of transmissions daily. High-frequency direction finding allowed analysts to estimate positions by triangulating signal origin. Patterns emerged from repetition. Aircraft carriers were powerful not only because of their planes, but because of how they coordinated those planes. That coordination depended on communication. By late May 1942, American analysts had mapped enough of the Japanese order of battle to predict task force movements. They could not read every message. But they could see the outline of the design. This was not perfect intelligence. It was probabilistic. Incomplete. But it was sufficient. Technology had shifted the nature of surprise. No longer did visibility alone determine awareness. A fleet could be hidden beyond the horizon and yet partially exposed through its electronic footprint. Midway would become the first major naval battle in history in which neither side's ships sighted one another directly. Aircraft would strike beyond visual range. Decisions would be made based on reconnaissance reports and radio intercepts. The ocean remained vast and indifferent. But beneath its surface, invisible currents of information were shaping the confrontation. And as June 4 approached, those currents would collide with doctrine, pride, and timing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew American industrial capacity could outproduce Japan if the war dragged on. His strategy from the beginning had been to strike hard, early, and decisively, to shock the United States into negotiation before factories could tilt the balance. Operation MI was conceived as the culmination of that logic. Midway would be seized. American carriers, compelled to respond, would be destroyed. The Pacific defensive perimeter would expand eastward. Japan would dictate the next phase of the war. But Yamamoto's plan carried structural weaknesses. His fleet was divided into widely separated task forces. The main carrier strike group, under Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, operated hundreds of miles ahead of Yamamoto's battleships. A separate force moved toward the Aleutians as a diversion. Submarines were positioned too late to form an effective scouting screen. Coordination depended on timing and surprise. Yamamoto assumed American intelligence was blind. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated vulnerability. The Coral Sea Battle in May 1942 had resulted in the loss of the light carrier Shoho and damage to Shokaku and Zuikaku, two carriers that would not participate at Midway, yet Japanese planners still believed American carrier strength was inferior and disorganized. Nagumo's four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried the core of Japan's elite naval aviators. Many had flown over Pearl Harbor. Their confidence was high. Their training was rigorous. But doctrine shaped their expectations. Japanese plans assumed Midway would be lightly defended. A dawn strike would neutralize airfields. A second wave might be required. Only afterward would carriers prepare for fleet engagement. What Japanese planners did not know was that American carriers were already waiting. The fragility of the operation lay not in strength, but in assumption. And assumptions are invisible until tested. By 1942, the battleship was no longer the unquestioned master of the sea. Pearl Harbor had revealed that aircraft could cripple capital ships in harbor. The Coral Sea had demonstrated that opposing fleets could fight entirely through aircraft without ships ever exchanging direct fire. Midway would confirm the transition. Aircraft carriers were both powerful and vulnerable. Their strength lay in range. Their weakness lay in exposed flight decks, fuel lines, and munitions storage. A single well-placed bomb could ignite catastrophic fires. Tactical success depended on timing, when aircraft were launched, when they were recovered, whether decks were clear or cluttered with fueled and armed planes. Nagumo's dilemma on the morning of June 4 would revolve around this exact vulnerability. His first strike against Midway launched at dawn. Reports suggested the island was not fully neutralized. He ordered reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack ordnance. Then a scouting plane reported American ships in the area. Rearming began again, bombs replaced with torpedoes. Each shift required time. Ordnance was moved across hangar decks. Fuel hoses connected and disconnected. Aircraft repositioned. Carriers, in those minutes, were most exposed. American doctrine differed. U.S. carriers operated with separate task groups, providing mutual scouting support. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters launched in coordinated waves, though in practice, coordination often faltered. At Midway, tactical execution would prove uneven on both sides. Torpedo squadrons would attack without fighter cover. Bombers would become separated from their escorts. Radio communication would break down. Yet the decisive moment would not emerge from flawless choreography. It would arise from convergence, altitude, timing, and chance intersecting over a fleet caught mid-transition. Intelligence provides clarity. It also creates pressure. In late May and early June 1942, American commanders knew a strike was coming. They knew roughly when. They knew roughly where. But knowledge did not eliminate uncertainty. It sharpened it. Nimitz understood that if his carriers were destroyed, Hawaii would lie vulnerable. The Pacific Fleet could be forced back to the West Coast. The psychological impact would echo beyond the military sphere. Rochefort and his team knew their assessment had placed those carriers in harm's way. Intelligence is never absolute. It is probability weighed against consequence. On the Japanese side, confidence masked tension. Nagumo faced the complexity of managing multiple waves of aircraft while maintaining readiness for fleet engagement. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft arrived late or incomplete. Each new fragment required reinterpretation of the operational picture. Both fleets operated without direct visual confirmation of the other's position. The ocean was empty. The sky held the only connection. By the night of June 3, 1942, American carriers lay northeast of Midway, concealed beyond expected search arcs. Japanese carriers approached from the northwest. Submarines probed. Long-range patrol aircraft scanned the horizon. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4, Japanese aircraft began launching toward Midway. Within hours, decisions made in quiet rooms would meet the violence of open sky. And the balance of the Pacific War would compress into a single morning. 4:30 a.m. On the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, signal lamps flashed in the pre-dawn darkness. Engines coughed to life. One by one, aircraft rolled forward into the wind and lifted from the carrier's wooden decks. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's first strike wave, 108 aircraft, climbed into the pale light and turned southeast toward Midway Atoll. Below them, the Pacific remained calm. On Midway, radar operators detected incoming formations shortly after 5:30 a.m. American Marine fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries prepared. At 6:20 a.m., Japanese bombers began their attack. Hangars burned. Fuel tanks ignited. Runways were cratered but not destroyed. Midway was damaged, not silenced. Strike leader Lieutenant Tomonaga radioed back, a second attack would be required. Nagumo now faced a decision. His reserve aircraft, held below decks, had initially been armed with torpedoes for a potential fleet engagement. Following doctrine, he had ordered them rearmed with bombs for land attack in case Midway required further suppression. At 7:28 a.m., a delayed reconnaissance report arrived from a scout plane launched by the cruiser Tone. It indicated sighting 10 ships east of Midway, later clarified to include at least one aircraft carrier. An American carrier force was present. Nagumo reversed course. Reserve aircraft were ordered rearmed again, bombs removed, torpedoes reinstalled. Inside the hangars, ordnance crews moved quickly. Bombs lay unsecured. Torpedoes were wheeled across deck space. Fuel lines remained connected to aircraft being serviced for the next launch cycle. This process required time. Above the Japanese fleet, American reconnaissance was already at work. A PBY Catalina flying boat sighted the carriers before dawn. Reports reached Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown, and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. The decision was immediate. Launch. At 7 a.m., American carriers began sending aircraft into the air, torpedo squadrons, dive bombers, and fighter escorts. Coordination proved difficult. Aircraft from different carriers departed at varying times and altitudes. Communication gaps widened the spacing between squadrons. The first American attacks reached the Japanese fleet shortly after 9:20 a.m. They came in low. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, descended toward the carriers without fighter cover. Japanese Zero fighters intercepted them swiftly. One by one, American TBD Devastators were shot down. Of the 15 aircraft in the squadron, 14 were lost. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water below the battle. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise followed. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. Each attack met concentrated defensive fire. None scored a hit. The sacrifice was severe. But these attacks forced the Japanese combat air patrol downward, away from higher altitudes where dive bombers might approach undetected. They also delayed Nagumo's launch of his own rearmed strike group. By 10 a.m., Japanese carriers were in a vulnerable state. Flight decks were partially cleared. Hangar decks held fueled aircraft and exposed ordnance. Defensive fighters were low on fuel and ammunition from repeated engagements. Meanwhile, American dive bomber groups from Enterprise and Yorktown had struggled to locate the enemy. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, faced a critical moment when fuel ran low and no enemy was in sight. Then he noticed a lone Japanese destroyer, Arisher, speeding north to rejoin the fleet after depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey turned to follow it. At 10:20 a.m., his decision placed American dive bombers directly above the Japanese carriers. They began their descent. 10:22 a.m. From 20,000 feet above the Pacific, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled onto their backs and began their descent. For several minutes before this moment, the sky above the Japanese fleet had seemed momentarily clear. Combat air patrol fighters were at low altitude pursuing torpedo squadrons. Deck crews were still in the process of rearming and refueling aircraft below. The first bombs fell on Kaga. Multiple direct hits struck her flight deck in rapid succession. Explosions rippled through the hangars where fueled aircraft and unsecured ordnance lay exposed. Fire erupted almost instantly. Within minutes, flames were uncontrollable. Seconds later, dive bombers from Enterprise shifted toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Only one bomb struck her directly, but it was enough. It pierced the flight deck and detonated among armed aircraft below. Secondary explosions followed. Fires spread across the hangar decks. To the north, aircraft from Yorktown targeted Soryu. 3 direct hits ignited aviation fuel and munitions. Smoke climbed thousands of feet into the air. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline fleet carriers were burning beyond recovery. The transformation was sudden. A strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was now crippled in a single coordinated descent. But the battle was not finished. Hiryu, positioned slightly apart from the other carriers, had escaped the initial attack. Her flight deck remained operational. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi ordered an immediate counterstrike. Late in the morning, dive bombers from Hiryu located and attacked Yorktown. Bomb hits caused heavy damage, knocking out boilers and reducing speed. Damage control teams worked quickly, restoring partial power. To Japanese reconnaissance, the carrier appeared disabled. In the afternoon, a second wave from Hiryu struck again. Torpedoes hit Yorktown, leaving her dead in the water. Meanwhile, American search aircraft continued scanning. By mid-afternoon, scouts located Hiryu. Dive bombers from Enterprise and the now damaged Yorktown, whose surviving aircraft had been transferred, launched again. Shortly before 5 p.m., bombs struck Hiryu. Fires spread rapidly. Like her sister ships, she was abandoned and scuttled the following day. By the evening of June 4, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were either sinking or fatally damaged. The battle continued through June 5 and 6 as American forces pursued retreating elements of Yamamoto's fleet. The heavy cruiser Mikuma was sunk. Submarine attacks later claimed Yorktown, which finally capsized on June 7 after repeated torpedo strikes. The cost to the United States was significant: 1 fleet carrier lost, along with a destroyer and 307 servicemen. Japan's losses were far greater: for fleet carriers, 1 cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and more than 3,000 sailors and aviators, including many of its most experienced carrier pilots. In 3 days, the offensive momentum of the Imperial Japanese Navy was broken. What had begun as an attempt to extend Japan's defensive perimeter ended as a strategic reversal. And in the quiet rooms where coded messages had first been studied, the scale of what had just occurred began to settle into understanding. The smoke from Midway still drifted over the Pacific when reports reached Tokyo. 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Along with them, nearly 250 aircraft, countless trained pilots, and over 3,000 sailors had been lost. These were not just ships, they were the core of Japan's naval striking power, vessels that had once dominated the Pacific and executed the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. For the United States, the tally was smaller but still significant. Yorktown, damaged but operational during the battle, was ultimately sunk by Japanese submarine attack after the battle, and the destroyer Hammond was lost alongside her. Approximately 307 American sailors and airmen perished. Yet the surviving carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, remained intact, battle-ready, and now positioned to take the initiative in the Central Pacific. The psychological impact was immediate. The Imperial Japanese Navy had believed itself invincible in carrier warfare, trained and battle-hardened. Pearl Harbor had demonstrated American vulnerability, Midway revealed American adaptation, ingenuity, and the lethal impact of foreknowledge. The loss of experienced pilots, many of whom had survived Pearl Harbor, would echo in every subsequent engagement. Replacements were inexperienced, and the quality of Japan's naval aviation would never fully recover. American confidence grew. The narrative shifted. The Pacific was no longer a theater in which Japan dictated the pace. Nimitz's gamble, trusting intelligence derived from broken codes, had paid off. Station HYPO's deciphering of JN-25, validation of AF is short on water, and careful deployment of carriers had transformed risk into decisive action. At sea, strategic balance had begun to tilt. For the first time, American forces were not merely reacting to Japanese operations, they were shaping them. Japan's ambitions to extend their defensive perimeter eastward had been checked. Their carefully timed operations had faltered against a combination of foresight, coordination, and courage. The shock reverberated beyond the ocean. Allied leaders, long cautious after Pearl Harbor, now had tangible evidence that Japanese advances could be halted. Midway became a symbol that intelligence, when applied decisively, could offset numerical and qualitative disadvantages. In the days following Midway, the magnitude of Japan's defeat became clear. For elite carriers were lost, along with their air groups, veteran pilots who had trained together for years and executed the Pearl Harbor attack. Their experience was irreplaceable. Japan's industrial capacity could build new ships, but the human element. Skilled aviators, maintenance crews, and command teams, had been decimated. The United States, while grieving its own losses, gained more than ships or planes. The survivors of Yorktown, along with Enterprise and Hornet, remained capable of projecting power. The balance in the Pacific shifted from defensive caution to calculated offense. The Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations was compromised, their offensive momentum had been broken. Midway's outcome validated intelligence as a decisive weapon. Commander Rochefort's meticulous work, piecing together fragments of JN-25, demonstrated that battles could be won before fleets ever sighted one another. The AF water shortage ruse became a legendary example of clever verification under pressure. Nimitz's trust in this intelligence, against skepticism from some Navy officials, had transformed raw information into actionable strategy. The psychological consequences were profound. Japanese commanders, including Admiral Yamamoto, now faced uncertainty where previously they had assumed supremacy. Operational caution replaced aggressive expansion. Plans for further offensives were delayed, and the emphasis shifted toward consolidating positions rather than extending them. Meanwhile, American forces grew more confident in their own capabilities, using intelligence and superior industrial output to dictate tempo. Midway also reshaped future Pacific operations. Guadalcanal, launched months later, capitalized on the momentum gained at Midway. The United States now had both a blueprint and a morale advantage. Intelligence-driven operations could offset numerical inferiority, and decisive, well-timed strikes could cripple an enemy before they could exploit their own advantages. In 3 days, a carefully hidden convergence of analysis, human decision, and technological capability had shifted the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The war would continue, fierce and costly, but the momentum had irreversibly changed. Midway was not won solely by bombs or torpedoes. It was won first in quiet rooms, over coffee-stained desks, by analysts deciphering strings of numbers that represented an enemy's intent. The war, in those 3 days, revealed a new truth: knowledge could be a weapon as lethal as a fleet of carriers. The victory reshaped naval warfare. Carriers replaced battleships as the decisive tools of the sea. Air power and intelligence became inseparable, each magnifying the other's effect. Yamamoto's carefully timed offensive failed not because of inferiority in firepower, but because foreknowledge allowed precise preparation and decisive action. For the United States, Midway was both tactical triumph and psychological turning point. It proved that ingenuity and courage could overcome previous humiliation, that calculated risk informed by intelligence could offset material disparity. The Pacific Fleet emerged stronger, emboldened, and poised to seize the initiative. For Japan, the loss was profound. Veteran aviators were gone. Carriers lost. Doctrinal assumptions challenged. The war's momentum had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as an attempt to extend empire became a defensive struggle. Ultimately, Midway illustrated a larger truth about warfare and history: sometimes the battles that decide a war are fought not in the sky, but in the shadows, in basements, on typewriters, over radio waves. Where patience, intellect, and observation shape destiny before a single shot is fired. The 3 days of June 4 to 6, 1942, became a testament to the quiet power of foresight, a victory measured not only in ships and planes lost, but in the unseen currents of strategy, intelligence, and human determination that turned the tide of the Pacific War.